We shall lecture now on Pierre Bayle and the issue of skepticism and Calvinism. Pierre Bayle is a dramatic lesson in how fleeting fame can be. He was one of the most widely known and influential authors of the 17th century, celebrated throughout the 18th century, who has fallen into remarkable public obscurity in the 20th century, when scholarly interest in him, however, has risen to new heights. His appeal is very difficult to overstate. His works are bestsellers in the 17th century. He is the editor of a scholarly journal of book reviews and commentary that is among the most widely circulated works in the erudite world of the 17th century. And his reputation in the 18th century is the subject of constant discussion among the new philosophers of that age. He also is a figure who illustrates particularly well the tensions and dilemmas of 17th century thought, because he is read and appropriated so diversely and differently, and because his reputation will undergo such a remarkable evolution. And let us begin there with Bayle's contemporaneous 17th century and then his later reputation, which will introduce us to the dilemma of Pierre Bayle. During his lifetime, Pierre Bayle is above all known as a thinker of the Calvinistic French Huguenot community. The Huguenots were the French Calvinists, expelled from France and settled in one of their major centers of refuge in Rotterdam. Throughout his lifetime, he is known as a leading Calvinistic thinker. He has critics who argue that, in fact, his arguments are dangerous, and perhaps he is secretly an enemy of the faith. But he teaches, in fact, in Protestant seminaries, participates in the most intense Calvinistic communities and debates. And he is known among those who know him best as a deeply religious and pious man. Within one generation, the free thinkers of the French Enlightenment, above all, will have appropriated him as a secret enemy of Christianity, as one of their own forebears, at the same time, paradoxically, that in German pietistic communities, he is celebrated as one of the leading Protestant thinkers, and at the ultra-Orthodox Calvinist Academy at Neuchâtel in Switzerland throughout the 18th century, his works are given to the best pupil as an award at the end of each year. But by the mid-18th century, the culture will know him as Pierre Bayle, the freethinker, Pierre Bayle, the enemy of religion, and even in some circles, Pierre Bayle, the friend of atheism. And it is that reputation, Bayle as freethinker, as rationalist, as precursor of the French Enlightenment, that will dominate until the mid-20th century, when there is a great flowering of scholarly interest in Pierre Bayle, given his influence, and people rediscover the deep Calvinism and Calvinistic context of his life in the French Huguenot community, and the contemporaneous religious responses to and implications of his positions and his debates. One of the things that occasions the scholarly interest in Bayle in the mid-20th century that will lead to the rediscovery of Bayle in his Huguenot Calvinist context is a brief flurry of interest in quantitative intellectual history. When in mid-century people got interested in things that you could count as historical evidence. And there were surveys done of private libraries in 18th century France. Each time an estate had to go through the courts, through probate, there was an inventory of books. And this gave historians a remarkable repository of evidence about what was owned and read. Well, it turned out that Pierre Bayle's works, and in particular his work, The Historical and Critical Dictionary, was the most widely owned book in all 18th century French private libraries. That discovery led to a great flurry of scholarly interest, which has brought the study of Bayle back to the center of 17th century intellectual history. What makes Bayle such a problematic figure in terms of this evolution of his reputation is the danger of the goal that he adopted in his lifetime, a pious but very problematic goal to humble human reason and to show our absolute dependence upon faith. And to accomplish that, Pierre Bayle set out to demonstrate the incompatibility of reason and faith. What could more show our dependence upon faith for religious belief than to show the non-rational foundations of Christian thought? What could more humble human reason than to show that human reason led arrogantly to a rejection of the foundations of humble Christian belief? One can understand, given that project of Pierre Bayle's, the humbling of reason and the exaltation of faith, by arguing the incompatibility of the two. One can understand how that accounts both for his place at the center of 17th century religious debate and his later appropriation as a precursor of the French Enlightenment. What we know about Pierre Bayle convinces us that religious sincerity, and above all, the sincerity of his connection to Huguenot Calvinism, French Protestant Calvinism, is the sincerity of that belief is beyond question. Pierre Bayle, deeply beloved by his family and very close to the Protestant family in which he was born, converted from Protestantism to Catholicism as a young man, an act that separated him from those he most loved. He then engaged, after long religious meditation, in a very dangerous reconversion from Catholicism to the Reformed Protestant faith in France, which made him a heretic in France of the worst kind, someone who had known God's truth in the Catholic Church and had abandoned it, having possessed it, for the religion of his birth. It led him to flee France and teach in Protestant academies at Sedan. He spent long years as a Calvinist teacher. When Louis XIV's armies took Sedan, Pierre Bayle fled to Rotterdam. His own brother died in the prisons of Louis XIV in Catholic France. And he engaged in then decades as a leading Calvinist polemicist with a central place in the divisions of European Calvinism and apologetics, debates with Catholic theology. He also occupied a very central place in the world of 17th century erudition and debate. He believed that one had to follow critical reason as far as it could take one, at which point one understood one's dependence upon faith for ultimate beliefs, but that following of critical reason as far as one could led to many a shock in his work. And in his lifetime, Europe found him a provocative and controversial thinker, arguing, among other things, that many pagan superstitions had remained within Christianity, that the confusion of philosophical issues with issues of faith and belief by conscience from Scripture, that confusion worked to the detriment both of critical reason and, above all, of faith. And he became known as one of Europe's foremost proponents of religious toleration, arguing that there could be no act more arrogant, more reflective of a pride that was absolutely incompatible with Christian humility than to have confidence in one's own beliefs, such that one would coerce the conscience of another human being, or persecute, or imprison, or torture, or kill that other human being. A Catholic apologist and skeptic of the late 16th century, Michel de Montaigne, had said something that Bayle took very much to heart. Montaigne had phrased it this way: it takes an extraordinary amount of confidence in one's own beliefs to burn another human being at the stake for them. For Pierre Bayle, that kind of arrogance was incompatible with Christian humility and incompatible with Christian love. And he set out to humble the arrogance of those theologians who, rather than trusting to all that one could trust to, one's private conscience in the hope of being a recipient of grace and true faith, rather than clinging to that Christian moment of possible salvation, they arrogantly prosecuted in the name of beliefs that he would show they could not even defend. His most influential work was his historical and critical dictionary, volumes in which very banal narrative text in each article, historical, religious, philosophical, is accompanied by lengthy footnotes, 90% of the article, in which major philosophical or erudite debates occur. And in this work, Bayle undertakes his voyage of erudition and the search for truth via a critical reason that comes to recognize its own dependence upon faith. Let's look at one of the articles that the Enlightenment later would read as a precursor of free thinking that had a very different meaning in Bayle's context, his article on King David, which shocked, intrigued, and delighted his contemporaries. The narrative of the article on King David simply tells the story of his life as recounted in Scripture. And in the footnotes, we learn again and again that David was a murderer, a thief, an adulterer, and beloved by God. That one could not make sense of that rationally, but one knew by faith that God's choices, elections, and actions were not man's, and that it was not man's place to judge of God's ultimate things and decisions. The article on King David shocked people because it laid out at extraordinary length the claims of King David, and rather than the crimes of King David, and rather than seeking to justify them or rationalize them as consistent with human natural virtue, as so many theologians had attempted to do, Bayle, without taking a step back, discussed his adultery, his covering himself with young, naked virgins, his sending the husbands of women after whom he lusted to their death, his period as a thief and as a traitor, as someone who lied, as someone who committed the most unspeakable crimes, and yet Scripture assured us as someone who was beloved by God, which everyone understood to mean someone who was chosen, elected by God, someone who was saved, King David. Let's put the article in context. Pierre Bayle was living in Rotterdam in the midst of a French Protestant community that had been outlawed and exiled from France, that had suffered untold miseries during persecutions, and whose leaders of that Huguenot community were attempting to forge a European coalition, a Protestant coalition, England and Holland at the core of it, to bring down Louis XIV, to overthrow him. Bayle preached tolerance and pacifism, that the Christian could not take up arms, that the Christian could not depose or execute a king. Well, what did those debates look like? The leader of the Huguenot community, one of Bayle's eventual deep adversaries, was a leading theologian named Pierre Jurieu. And his sermons on King Louis XIV of France took this form. Most kings, indeed, we are commanded to obey in Scripture. They are given to us by God. But look at King Louis. He's a murderer. He's a liar. He's a thief. He's an adulterer. So we are rid of any obligation of pacifism or of obedience to him. Well, now replay Bayle's article on David in your mind. What is David? Everything that Louis XIV is described as being. And yet he is an anointed king, given to a nation by God. Let's look at the article on David in yet another religious context. One of the things that Catholic apologists, an apologist does not mean people who apologize for the faith, it means who defend the faith. An apologia of one's life is a defense of one's life, not an apology for one's life. That's a remarkable transformation in meaning that's occurred. One of the things that Catholic defenders of the faith, Catholic apologists, often directed against Orthodox Calvinism was that the Calvinist, believing God's predestination of who is saved and who is damned, that God's choice of the elect is a mystery unknowable by the study of human behavior. We're telling people that even the worst sinner could be someone who was saved by God, beloved by God, whereas the most pious Christian who gave money to charity, who attended service, who was active in the life of the church, could be damned. And many Calvinist apologists began to back off and say that those who were justified by God's grace and sanctified, made holy by God's grace, would have external marks of their sanctification, of their being saved, justified, and made holy. For Pierre Bayle, St. Augustine and Calvin had it right the first time. Salvation was a mystery beyond human comprehension. There was no natural philosophy that was going to unravel and understand the mystery, beyond mystery, of God's love and salvation. Someone could be justified and saved through the blood of Christ without having marks that allowed natural human judgment to say, we know that God has saved this man and damned that man, and that would not allow anyone to say, I know by the marks of my character that God has saved me and damned my neighbor. Now, again, replay the article on King David in one's mind. For what it is stressing and does explicitly is the absolute Christian mystery of salvation, justification, and sanctification. It was precisely beyond human comprehension that God should save anyone, and whom God saved was at the election of God, not open to the judgment and scrutiny of man. David had done all of these crimes, but David was beloved by God. What are the intellectual issues here? That in understanding the mysteries, we have only faith, whatever the scandal, to those who don't have faith. But hadn't Scripture itself told us that what was wisdom to the Christian would be folly to the world? That the pagan never would understand, the philosopher never would understand, that we were Christians by faith. But if there is to be faith, then we have an obligation to natural judgment when we use our natural reason. That alone allows faith. So the Christian must say, by natural lights, David is a sinner. By natural lights, David has committed unspeakable crimes, and we declare them to be such. But it is revealed to us in Scripture that he was beloved by God. How could God do that? Who was a human being to put natural reason to that question? How could God do that? Who were human beings to judge of the justice or injustice, goodness or evil of the deity who by faith is justice, who by faith is goodness, independent of all human judgment? And Bayle set out in the dictionary to make that point with the dramatic article in Manichaeans, a heresy that argued that the world was divided between two powers, one infinitely good, one infinitely evil, that warred. Bayle set out to argue in the article on Manichaean that the Christian could not overcome, the Christian philosopher or theologian could not overcome by natural argument the Manichaean in debate. That the person who said, I do not see uniform good in the world, could not be convinced, Bayle would write, by evidence in one article on the subject, by logic in another article on the subject, or by reason in any form in yet another article on the subject. From the suffering of the world, from the fact that an infinitely good God allowed evil in the world and the triumph of wickedness in the world, one could not conclude by natural reason for the goodness of God. But by faith, the Christian knew the goodness of God. Only faith resolves the paradoxes of the coexistence of evil and suffering and God's omnipotent power with the infinite goodness of God. Reason never can accomplish that. But Christianity is filled with such paradoxes. Reason cannot understand the Trinity, and the Enlightenment loved to quote Bayle on the problem of God's goodness, the problem of the Trinity. But Bayle also accepted the Greek skeptical paradoxes on motion, leading to the conclusion that there could be no motion in the world, that nothing could not always be in one place at one time, hence no motion was possible. And Bayle was not ever against the new physics. Reason was too weak to understand ultimate things. Bayle's skepticism is directed against all intellectual confidence. What resolves the tensions of belief for Bayle is humility, tolerance, and the quiet belief by faith and by the best lights of one's own conscience. Bayle was opposed often by outraged theologians. He so consistently tried to demonstrate the mystery of Christian faith and the danger of superstition in Christianity when it departed from simple faith. He wrote with shame of Christian fear of comets, of Christian acceptance of witchcraft, manias, and persecutions. These had no place in the quiet faith and critical reason of the Christian. When Christians argued that there was universal consent to God's goodness, Bayle said, before Christianity there was universal consent to polytheism or to a denial of a God of three persons. Universal consent meant nothing. Faith meant everything. The atheist and the Christian could be equally virtuous for Pierre Bayle. That was an historical reality. It was not human belief. It was the grace of faith that saved. For Pierre Bayle, the crucial need always was to avoid the overextension of human claims and hold to the simple faith by conscience of a Christian. But he is writing about the incompatibility of reason and faith at just that moment when a tidal change is occurring in the culture that will affect perception of Bayle's writings. Given a culture increasingly swept away in confidence in the new philosophy, in reason, in science, in evidence, Bayle is read as irreligious. His David gives rise to Voltaire's article, David, a generation later, talking about the absurdity of Christian ethics. Bayle's notion of faith persists, but it is occurring on a wave of naturalization and rational commitment in a culture that is rapidly abandoning the belief that Bayle holds, that the world is only clear religiously if reason's light is diminished. Thank you.